The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to share the inheritance with me." He replied to him, "Friend, who has appointed me as your judge and arbitrator?" Then he said to the crowd, "Take care to guard against all greed, for though one may be rich, one's life does not consist of possessions." Then he told them a parable. There was a rich man whose land produced a bountiful harvest. He asked himself, "What shall I do, for I do not have space to store my harvest?" And he said, "This is what I shall do. I shall tear down my barns and build larger ones. There I shall store all my grain and other goods, and I shall say to myself, 'Now as for you, you have many good things stored up for many years. Rest, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this night your life will be demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, to whom they will belong. Thus it will be for all those who store up treasure for themselves, but are not rich in what matters to God.'" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Hallelujah.
Can you hear me? That's too bad. My Uncle Charlie, when I was growing up, was a pretty wealthy man. He had a Rolls Royce, he had a DeLorean, he had a Jaguar, he had an 8,500 square foot mansion on the top of the Glendale Hills. As we were sitting in the jacuzzi in the pool that was shaped in the form of a G for the name of Ganges, he told me, "Fred, if I could take it with me, it would burn anyway." That got me to think, what happens if God told me in prayer that he was going to visit me tomorrow? What would I do? What would I say? What would I offer to God? What would I consider of value that I could offer to God? You know, in today's gospel, it's an interesting gospel because Jesus tells a parable to avoid greed in all of its forms. I'm sure that Jesus came up with this parable after his incident with the rich young man. The rich young man came up to Jesus and he wanted to be part of Jesus' company. It's the only time that Jesus made a qualification to someone who asked to follow. He said, "Have you followed the commandments?" Well, the rich young man responded, "Well, of course. I obey my mom and dad. I don't lie, I don't cheat, I don't steal, I don't commit adultery. I go to Sabbath. I'm in good shape." Well, Jesus asked him a simple thing. "Okay, go, sell what you have, give it to the poor, and then come and follow me." Well, the rich young man walks away sad because the only commandment that he didn't follow was the first one, to put God above all things. It's interesting because for me, I realized, why did Christ ask this person for qualifications? He didn't ask Peter, he didn't ask James, he didn't ask John. In fact, when he went to the home of Zacchaeus, he didn't have any qualifications for Zacchaeus. He was a tax collector. He was wealthy, and he cheated to get his money. But there were no qualifications that Jesus asked for. In fact, all Jesus said, "Zacchaeus, today I'm coming to your house." And Zacchaeus is ecstatic, happy. So he goes to the house where all the sinners are. Why? Because Zacchaeus is a tax collector. The reality is Zacchaeus gives half of his belongings to the poor. He admits that if he's cheated anybody, he's going to pay them back fourfold. Could you imagine the IRS doing that to you today? Jesus says salvation has come to this house. But it wasn't the same requirements as the rich young man. Why? Because Zacchaeus put God first now. You know, it's interesting in the capital sins, greed, selfishness, envy, jealousy, they all point to the self. When Mother Teresa of Calcutta, in her last visit to the United States, she said that she was amazed at the poverty of this nation. She wasn't referring to a lack of material goods. She was referring to the spiritual poverty that she encountered. Too much was about the self, the ego. It's interesting because ego means easing God out. If we're going to be rich spiritually, we've got to put God first. That means above all things. What is it that I hold on to? What is it that I want to keep? What is preventing me from loving God above all things? Is it a fear? Is it a lack of health? Concern about the future? What could it be? Jesus is asking us to put God first in all things, just as he did. Even if it meant ridicule, even if it meant abandonment, even if it meant friends would turn their back on you, even if it meant you didn't have a lot of wealth. It didn't matter for Jesus. Why? Because Jesus put God first. And in putting God first, all of a sudden, Jesus put the people, the children of God, first as well. For Jesus, there was no discrimination based on the fact, are you rich or are you poor? Are you male or are you female? Are you educated or not educated? Are you Jewish or Greek? Slave or free? For Jesus, it made no difference. Because of his great love of God, of his Father, he was now able and free to love everybody the same, perfectly. He put no conditions on anyone. That's one of the difficulties that we face with greed or selfishness, envy or jealousy. There's conditions that we put on people. It's difficult to see people as children of God. But if you think about it, this is why Jesus established the church, so we could call each other brother and sister. And that brother and sister means equal, the same. In establishing the great gift of the church, Jesus now shares his full self in the Eucharist to let us know that we are the same. Brothers and sisters. Why? Because we're all children of God. That's where our value comes from. I always find it interesting that the world keeps track of the world's wealthiest people. The problem is, they can't take it with them. And I hope it doesn't burn anyway. I was listening to an article. 5 years ago, there was a wealthy German industrialist. He committed suicide. He was worth $9 billion. As I continued to listen to the article, I was curious, why would he commit suicide? Because he lost $2 billion. If we do not see our value because of God's love for us, then how is it possible to see the value that's in each other. After all, Christ became human being. It's in the incarnation that our humanity has been restored to its full dignity. It's in this that we have our wealth and our value. Anything else treats us as less. We should not see simply the poor as people to help, but as a brother or a sister. We should not see the rich as somebody to ask from, but rather a brother and a sister. Too often, we treat each other based on what you can and cannot do. That's not what Jesus would do. What if Jesus were to tell you in prayer that he was going to come to you tomorrow? What would you do? What would you offer him? What great treasure do you have? There's a story that helps to put it in perspective for me. It's the story about the hermit in the cave. The hermit was in prayer. God told him, tomorrow, I'm going to visit you. So the hermit is excited. So he goes out, he picks nice, rich, ripe fruit, fresh vegetables. He's going to make a wonderful meal for God. He's been working on his sculptures, on his sculptures and his paintings. And he's going to share these riches with God. So the next day, God shows up, and the hermit is excited. So the first thing he does, he brings out the sculpture and says, here, God, this is for you. And God says, well, let's see. I made the tree. I gave you the talent to do this. That's mine. I want something that's yours. This is no problem. So he goes back in, he gets a painting. He brings it back out and says, here, God, this is for you. He says, you know what? The stones that you crushed for the color, I made those. I made the canvas that you painted on. I gave you the talent to do this. This is mine. I want something that's yours. So the hermit goes back in the cave and he says, not a problem. Wait till God gets a hold of this meal. Brings out this fabulous meal. Rich tasting. Wonderful. God says, no, I made the vegetables. I made the fruits. And I gave you the talent to cook. I want something that is yours. So now the hermit is concerned. He goes back into his cave. He wonders, what can I do? Then he finally realizes, I know. He goes back out to God and says, God, here is my life. It's yours. God says, I made you. You're mine. I want something that's yours. So the hermit goes back into his cave. He's in tears. He's sad. He's even afraid. What can I do? Finally, he comes back out of the cave. He humbles himself before God. And with the tears in his eyes, he says, God, here are my sins. And God says, finally, something that's yours. I'll take them. When it comes to the true treasure of who God is for us, we have to remember we have nothing to offer God except our sins. Because that's really all that we have. Therefore, it's a good idea to have great love, great thanksgiving, great humility, to thank God for the gift of who God is, that he has given each one of us infinite value by sending his Son, by giving us the gift of the Eucharist, by our Holy Father declaring this great year of mercy. This is what gives us value. And I hope today we realize that precious gift we all have. Because if the only thing that I can give God is my sins, then I'm thankful to God for all that he has done for me.